May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The guns fell silent across the continent, and church bells rang from London to Paris, from Moscow to the small farming towns of Iowa. But in the heart of America, deep in the pine forests of Georgia, across the cotton fields of Texas, in the mountains of Colorado, another sound persisted. The sound of hammering, of sawing, of diesel engines hauling construction materials down dirt roads toward camps that had sprung up like strange cities in the rural American landscape. Behind barbed wire, nearly 400,000 enemy soldiers waited. German, Italian, a handful of Japanese. They had crossed oceans to fight against democracy, and now they stood on its soil, uncertain of their fate. In Camp Alva, Oklahoma, a 19-year-old German paratrooper named Helmut Horner sat on the edge of his bunk as the evening light slanted through the barracks window. He had been told the war was over. He had expected execution, or at the very least, starvation rations and forced labor until death claimed him. Instead, that afternoon, he had eaten roast chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie. He stared at his hands, still smelling faintly of soap from the hot shower he'd taken that morning. Outside, American guards played baseball in a field adjacent to the camp. Their laughter carried on the wind. Horner did not understand. None of them did. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary and least told stories of the Second World War, not the story of combat, but the story of what came after. The story of how America treated its enemies when the shooting stopped, and what that treatment revealed about the nation itself. The prisoners had arrived throughout the war years, beginning in 1943 after the North African campaign delivered tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers into Allied custody. The British, struggling to house and feed their own population under relentless rationing, could not manage the flood of captives. Winston Churchill made a request. Could America take them? The United States, with its vast landmass and agricultural abundance, agreed. And so they came, by ship across the Atlantic, by train across the American heartland, until they found themselves in places whose names they could barely pronounce: Mexia, Texas; Concordia, Kansas; Hearne, Dermot, Ruston, Greeley. Camps were constructed in 46 states, often in rural areas where labor was scarce and local economies had been hollowed out by men leaving for the front lines. These were not concentration camps. That distinction mattered. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, and the War Department took its obligations seriously, not merely as legal necessity, but as ideological demonstration. If America was fighting for a world where human dignity mattered, where law prevailed over cruelty, then that principle had to extend even to captured enemies. The camps were designed accordingly. Barracks were heated in winter, ventilated in summer. Medical care was provided. Prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers, 2,800 calories per. Mail service was established. International Red Cross inspectors were welcomed without restriction. The German prisoners could not believe it. Men who had fought in Russia, who had seen the frozen corpses of their comrades stacked like cordwood outside Stalingrad, who had eaten horses and worse just to survive, these men now found themselves eating eggs and bacon for breakfast, playing soccer in organized leagues, attending classes in English or woodworking or music theory. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Gefreiter Ernst Froemgen, captured in Tunisia, wrote in a letter that somehow passed through censors, "We are not prisoners. We are guests in a land that does not know what war truly is." But they were prisoners. And the question that haunted American policymakers, military officials, and ordinary citizens alike was this: what do you do with nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers when the war ends? How do you send them home? And more troubling still, what if they don't want to go? The problem began even before VE Day. As early as 1944, reports filtered back to Washington from camp commanders describing a troubling phenomenon: prisoners who excelled in their work assignments, who learned English fluently, who asked questions about American citizenship requirements. Italian prisoners, declared co-belligerents after Italy's surrender in 1943, were allowed significantly more freedom. Many worked on farms and formed genuine friendships with the families who employed them. When the war in Europe ended, and the time came for repatriation, some simply vanished into the American landscape. They changed their names, married local women, built lives in the small towns where they had labored. The U.S. government, overwhelmed by the scale of demobilization, did not pursue them aggressively. The Germans presented a more complex challenge. Among the 380,000 German POWs in American camps, a vast ideological spectrum existed. Some remained fanatical Nazis who organized. secret tribunals, intimidated fellow prisoners, and murdered those suspected of cooperating with the Americans. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a young German private named Johannes Kunz was beaten to death by 5 fellow prisoners because he was believed to be an informer. His killers were tried, convicted, and hanged, an execution that shocked the remaining POWs, who had not expected American justice to be so swift or so final. But others had lost faith in the Führer long before capture. They had seen the Eastern Front. They had witnessed the SS atrocities. They had been drafted at 16 and fed into the meat grinder of a losing war, and they knew the Third Reich was a lie wrapped in propaganda and blood. For these men, the POW camps became classrooms in democracy. The U.S. Army launched a re-education program, officially called the Intellectual Diversion Program, which brought in German-speaking instructors, screened Hollywood films, distributed newspapers, and encouraged critical discussions about Nazism, totalitarianism, and democratic governance. The program was voluntary, but thousands participated. They watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and debated the possibility of representative government. They read Thomas Mann and listened to lectures on the Weimar Republic's collapse. They began to imagine a different Germany. When the war ended, the question became urgent: where would they go? Germany in 1945 was an apocalypse. Cities lay in ruins, incinerated by firebombing campaigns. Millions were displaced, starving, living in cellars and rubble. The infrastructure of the state had collapsed. The Allies had divided the country into occupation zones, and already the Soviet zone was sealing itself off, imposing a brutal communist regime. For a German POW held in a comfortable camp in Virginia or California, the prospect of repatriation was not liberation, it was a return to hell. The American government faced political pressure from multiple directions. Labor unions feared that retaining German POWs would undercut American workers returning from the front. Families of American servicemen killed in combat demanded that enemy soldiers be sent home immediately. But farmers and factory owners, who had come to rely on POW labor, lobbied for extensions. And military planners, looking ahead to the occupation of Germany, saw value in retaining a pool of German-speaking men who had been exposed to American ideals and could potentially assist in reconstruction and denazification efforts. The solution was gradual repatriation, beginning in late 1945 and extending into 1946. Prisoners were screened and categorized. Known Nazi Party members, SS officers, and those implicated in war crimes were held for further investigation and potential prosecution. Others were released in stages, prioritized by factors including age, family situation, and the stability of their home regions. But as the transports began, reports started to arrive from the returnees themselves, letters smuggled out, accounts relayed through the Red Cross, describing conditions in occupied Germany that were, in some respects, worse than the camps they had left. Food shortages were severe. Housing was nearly impossible to find. Jobs were non-existent. And in the Soviet zone, returning POWs were often viewed with suspicion, interrogated as potential collaborators, sometimes arrested and sent to new camps run by the NKVD. In the summer of 1946, Camp Como in Mississippi still held nearly 2,000 German prisoners. The war had been over for more than a year, but shipping shortages and bureaucratic delays had slowed repatriation to a crawl. The prisoners worked in the cotton fields and lumber mills, earning 80 cents per day in canteen scrip. They had formed a symphony orchestra that performed for local townspeople. They had built a scale model of a German village, complete with tiny churches and houses, displayed in the camp recreation hall. They played chess and wrote letters and waited. One evening, a group of them sat outside their barracks, smoking cigarettes purchased at the camp canteen, American cigarettes, Camels and Lucky Strikes, the taste of which had become familiar, even comforting. They spoke in low voices about what awaited them. One man, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, said his city had been burned to ash. Another, a farmer's son from Bavaria, said his family's letters mentioned constant hunger, mentioned children begging for bread. A third man, who had fought at Normandy and been captured on the road to Cherbourg, said simply, "I am not going back to die slowly." They were not alone in that sentiment. Across the American POW camp system, prisoners began to resist repatriation in subtle ways. They would claim illness. They would produce documents suggesting they were from regions under Soviet control, knowing such cases required additional review. Some attempted to escape, not to evade captivity, but to disappear into America itself. In Texas, a German POW named George Gartner walked away from his work detail in September 1945 and vanished. He lived under assumed names, working as a ski instructor and hotel clerk, for 40 years before voluntarily revealing himself in 1985. By then, he was an old man, fully integrated into American society. When his story broke, there was no prosecution, only a shrug from authorities and a collective sense that perhaps justice, in his case, had been served by time. But most did go back. They had families, obligations, identities tied to the soil of Europe. And so the ships sailed, converted troop transports, now carrying the defeated home across the Atlantic. The men stood on deck as America receded behind them, staring at the horizon where the Statue of Liberty disappeared, and many wept. They wept not for Germany, but for the loss of abundance, for the end of their strange interlude in a nation where even prisoners ate well, where the guards did not beat you for no reason, where you could argue about politics without fear of execution. The camps themselves began to close. The barracks were dismantled or repurposed. Some became housing for migrant workers. Others were sold as surplus, the lumber hauled away to build post-war subdivisions. The land returned to farms, to forests, to the quiet obscurity it had known before the war. In towns across America, the memory of the camps faded quickly. Local newspapers moved on to stories of demobilization, the return of American servicemen, the booming post-war economy. The German prisoners who had lived and worked among them became footnotes, curiosities, half-remembered anecdotes told over coffee at the diner. Remember when we had those Germans out at the old fairgrounds? But the prisoners did not forget. Letters began to arrive in the 1950s, addressed to former camp commanders, to farmers who had employed them, to guards who had shown them kindness. They wrote in halting English, describing their lives in the new West Germany, their struggles to rebuild, their gratitude for the treatment they had received. Some asked if they could return, as immigrants this time, not prisoners. Some did. They obtained visas, sailed back across the Atlantic with their families, and settled in the same towns where they had once been held captive. They opened bakeries and machine shops, joined churches, enrolled their children in the local schools. In time, their origins became known but unremarkable, absorbed into the vast American capacity for reinvention and second chances. The Italian POWs, many of whom had stayed illegally, regularized their status through various immigration amnesties in the post-war decades. They became citizens, indistinguishable from the millions of other Italian Americans who had arrived generations earlier. Their children grew up entirely American, unaware that their fathers had once worn enemy uniforms, had once crossed the ocean in chains. The Japanese prisoners were a different story. Far fewer in number, only about 5,000 were held in camps in the continental United States. They faced a more uncertain fate. Japan's surrender came in August 1945, and repatriation began almost immediately. Unlike the Germans, the Japanese prisoners were not seen as potential allies or subjects for re-education. The Pacific War had been a different kind of conflict, marked by atrocities and racial hatred that left little room for the kind of ambiguity that complicated the treatment of European prisoners. Most Japanese POWs returned to a devastated homeland where Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in radioactive ruins, where food shortages were catastrophic, where the emperor had been forced to announce surrender in a voice the people had never heard before. Those who had been captured, an act considered deeply shameful under the Bushido Code, returned to suspicion and ostracism. Many struggled to reintegrate, their shame compounded by the knowledge that they had lived in relative comfort while their families had endured firebombing and starvation. By 1947, the last of the Axis POWs had left American soil. The camps were gone. The barbed wire was rolled up and sold for scrap. The guard towers were demolished. The land healed. And America, flush with victory and entering the greatest economic expansion in its history, turned its attention to the future. The Marshall Plan, the United Nations, the beginnings of the Cold War. The Axis prisoners became a minor historical curiosity, a bureaucratic footnote to the massive enterprise of global conflict. But something had happened in those camps, something that could not be erased by the passage of time or the dismantling of barracks. An encounter had taken place between two visions of human society, two answers to the question of how people ought to live. On one side, the prisoners brought with them the legacy of totalitarianism, the belief that the individual existed to serve the state. That hierarchy was natural and absolute, that might conferred right. They had been raised under fascism, had marched in its parades, had absorbed its propaganda through school and youth organizations and relentless media. They had been taught that democracy was weak, decadent, doomed. And then they came to America. They saw a nation that fed them when it did not have to, that treated them according to law rather than whim, that allowed them to speak freely among themselves, to organize cultural events, to maintain their dignity even in captivity. They worked alongside American civilians and discovered that these people were not the caricatures of propaganda. They were farmers and shopkeepers, men and women who argued about baseball and politics, who complained about taxes and rationing, who expressed opinions their government did not control. The prisoners saw abundance, yes, the endless fields of wheat, the supermarkets in nearby towns, the casual waste of a society that had never known true hunger. But more than abundance, they saw a system that did not require terror to function. They saw people who were not afraid of their own government. This was the symbolism that recurred in their accounts, the image that haunted their letters and memoirs, the American guard who shared his cigarettes, the farmer's wife who invited a work detail into her kitchen for lunch, the camp commander who allowed prisoners to stage a production of Goethe's Faust and attended the performance himself, applauding at the end. These were not acts of strategic importance. They did not shorten the war or influence its outcome, but they were acts of civilization, expressions of a belief that even in conflict, certain principles must be upheld. The German soldiers who returned to their ruined country carried those memories with them. In the chaos of the late 1940s, as Germany struggled to rebuild, some of those former prisoners became influential voices. They joined political parties, taught in schools, wrote for newspapers. They spoke about their time in America, not with bitterness, but with a kind of wonder. They described a society that had wealth but shared it, that had power but restrained it, that had enemies but did not dehumanize them. These accounts fed into the larger project of denazification and democratization that the Western Allies were attempting to impose on West Germany. They provided a counter-narrative to the Nazi indoctrination that had so thoroughly poisoned German thought. Did it work? Did the treatment of Axis POWs in American camps contribute meaningfully to the transformation of Germany and Italy into stable democracies? The historical record cannot answer that question with certainty. Too many factors shaped the post-war order. The Marshall Plan's economic aid, the presence of occupation forces, the shock of defeat, the revelation of Holocaust atrocities, the broader cultural reckoning with fascism. But among the many threads woven into that transformation, the experience of the POWs was one. A small thread, perhaps, but real. In Italy, the transformation was more immediate. The Italian prisoners, having fought half-heartedly for a regime most of them despised, reintegrated quickly into a society that was eager to forget Mussolini and embrace the post-war democratic order. The Christian Democrats, who dominated Italian politics for decades, included among their members men who had spent time in American POW camps and returned with admiration for American pragmatism and pluralism. The American people themselves were largely unaware of the scale or significance of the POW program. The camps had been rural, isolated, intentionally placed away from major population centers to prevent both escapes and public unrest. Most Americans knew vaguely that enemy prisoners were being held somewhere, but the details were obscure. The war had been framed as a moral crusade, and there was discomfort in acknowledging that the crusaders were feeding and housing the enemy better than the enemy had ever treated Allied prisoners. And that contrast was stark. American, British, and Commonwealth POWs held by the Japanese suffered mortality rates above 25%, death by starvation, disease, execution, forced labor. Those held by the Germans fared better in the West, worse in the East, but always under conditions of scarcity and brutality that bore no resemblance to the American camps. The death rate for Axis POWs in American custody was less than 1%, and most of those deaths resulted from accidents or pre-existing medical conditions, not mistreatment. This asymmetry raised uncomfortable questions. Why should America treat its enemies well when those enemies had shown no such restraint? Why uphold principles that the other side had violated? The answer, provided by policymakers and military leaders, was both pragmatic and philosophical. Pragmatically, good treatment of POWs encouraged surrender, reduced resistance, and facilitated post-war cooperation. Philosophically, it demonstrated that American values were not contingent, they applied even when inconvenient, even when extended to those who did not deserve them. That argument did not satisfy everyone. Families of servicemen who had died in Japanese prison camps protested the comfortable conditions in American POW facilities. Editorials were written demanding harsher treatment. But the government held firm. The camps would operate according to the Geneva Convention, not according to the passions of revenge. By 1948, the last German POW had departed American soil. The repatriation was complete. The camps were empty. The files were archived, and in the halls of the Pentagon and the State Department, officials turned their attention to the emerging Cold War, to the Berlin airlift, to the question of how to rebuild Europe as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The POWs were forgotten, but they remembered. In the 1960s, as West Germany experienced its Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed it into the wealthiest nation in Europe, a peculiar phenomenon emerged. German veterans, now middle-aged businessmen and civil servants, began traveling to the United States as tourists. They rented cars and drove through Oklahoma, through Texas, through Kansas, searching for the camps where they had been held. Most found nothing, the barracks were gone, the land returned to farms. But they walked the fields anyway, pointing to where the mess hall had stood, where the soccer pitch had been, where they had planted a garden and grown tomatoes in the summer of 1945. They brought their children, tried to explain what it had been like, struggled to convey the strangeness of being an enemy prisoner in a land that treated you like a human being. Some of them wrote books. Memoirs appeared in German, rarely translated into English, recounting their experiences. The titles were telling: Guest of the Enemy, An Unexpected Captivity, The Good War for the Defeated. The tone was often elegiac, tinged with nostalgia for a time and place that no longer existed, a provisional America of small towns and open skies, a Germany that had not yet been divided by the Iron Curtain. What does it mean, in the end, that America treated its wartime enemies with decency? What does it reveal about the nation, about the principles it claimed to embody? The camps were not perfect. Abuses occurred. Some guards were cruel. Some prisoners were exploited for labor in ways that skirted the boundaries of the Geneva Convention. The re-education programs were, in part, propaganda efforts designed to serve American strategic interests. The generosity extended to Axis prisoners stood in stark contrast to the internment of Japanese Americans, citizens stripped of their rights and property based solely on their ancestry. A hypocrisy that haunts the narrative of American wartime justice. But the camps also demonstrated something undeniable: that it is possible, even in the midst of existential conflict, to adhere to principles that transcend immediate advantage. That the content of a nation's character is revealed not in how it treats friends, but in how it treats enemies. That abundance, when shared, becomes a form of soft power more persuasive than any propaganda. The German prisoners did not return home convinced that America was perfect, but they returned convinced that democracy was real, that it functioned, that it offered a model worth emulating. In the ruins of post-war Germany, as the nation struggled to confront its crimes and imagine a different future, those seeds bore fruit. The Federal Republic that emerged in 1949 was built, in part, by men who had seen an alternative to totalitarianism, who had lived briefly under a system that did not require terror, who had tasted the strange and unsettling freedom of a society that trusted its citizens to argue and dissent and build their own lives. The transformation of Germany from fascist dictatorship to stable democracy was the work of many hands, shaped by many forces. But among those forces, in ways both subtle and profound, was the memory of American POW camps, where even enemies were fed, where even captivity included a measure of dignity, where the abundance of a free society was made manifest in the simple, extraordinary fact of 3 meals a day and guards who did not beat you. That is what happened to America's POW camps after the war ended. They were dismantled, forgotten, reduced to historical footnotes. But the men who passed through them carried something away, a memory, a possibility, a glimpse of how human beings might live together without the machinery of oppression. And that memory, planted in the soil of a ruined continent, grew into something unexpected, a Germany rebuilt, a Europe at peace, a world where the defeated were given a chance to become something other than what they had been. It is a small story, in the grand sweep of the Second World War, but it is not an insignificant one, because it speaks to the question every nation must answer: what do you do with your power when the fighting is over? Do you wield it as a cudgel, or do you extend it as a hand? America, in those years, chose the latter. And in that choice, there lies a lesson that time has not diminished. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the light of principle can endure, and that decency, once demonstrated, is never entirely forgotten. The camps are gone. The prisoners are gone. But the meaning of what happened there remains, waiting in the archives, in the fading letters, in the memories of old men who once stood behind barbed wire on American soil and learned, to their lasting astonishment, that the enemy was not what they had been told.